Hey Emma, how's it going? How are you today?
Good. Doing great.
Awesome. Thanks so much for coming on. We're really looking forward to chatting with you. And I was wondering if we could start like in first kind of segment, talking a little bit about you, like your history. So the first thing I was wondering is, could you say, would you be willing to talk about your political history, like things that motivated you about to get involved in emancipatory politics, socialism, etc.? Does anything come up with that question?
Absolutely,
Okay.
sure. So my name is Emma. I Me and my family moved around a lot when I was growing up, but I mostly grew up in a town called Poquoson, Virginia, in the southeastern part of Virginia called Hampton Roads. Very military area, very um, uh, used to be more conservative. It's actually becoming more liberal. But my hometown of Poquoson is still very, very conservative. You know, voted for Trump in both elections by more than 75%. And growing up there, at first I kind of just was sort of a sponge for the local politics, particularly because, I was a young teen in the worst part of the uh, reaction to the September 11th attacks. Um, which really swept up this area because it was so big. It's like one of the most densely military areas in the world. And So I was giving all of the cringy, terrible slogans. We gotta support the troops, and my grandma, my mom's mom, um, she grew up in Chicago, and she came to visit us one day, and she always had these great conversations with me. Usually when we were like playing cards, we talk about everything from music to philosophy to politics. And so she asked me what I thought about the imminent war with Iraq, because I think, oh no, I'm sorry, the war had already started at that point. So she asked me about the current war in Iraq, and I gave the hoorah, support the troops line. And she was like, oh no, this isn't good. So she insisted that I go with her to a movie called Fahrenheit 9/11 by Michael Moore. And I saw that movie, and I was really blown away by things that were said in the movie. And I thought to myself, this stuff can't possibly be true. But I took the time to look into it and saw that, yes, almost everything in that movie is very true. And That just really kind of opened me up to this whole other way of looking at the world. And A couple of years later, I joined the Socialist Party of the United States, Socialist Party USA, I think around like 2005 or around then. Um, and I would later be a member of Socialist Alternative, which is a small Trotskyist socialist group, most famous for electing Shama Sawant in Seattle as a city council member. And then I left that organization and joined DSA, the Democratic Socialists of America, in 2016. Um, and um, I went to college in Virginia. Um, uh, was really focused on labor organizing when I was in college in terms of politics. I came to New York and I did some work with the sex worker rights movement and with people in prison through groups like the Sylvia Rivera Law Project and Black and Pink. And I went to law school at the City University of New York Law School, the best law school, in my opinion. And I am currently a lawyer. I practice law at a private firm called the Law Office of Ahmad Keshevars. Full disclaimer, nothing I say here is a representation of the firm's policies or stances on anything, obviously. But I do what's called consumer rights litigation. So basically, I sue banks and debt collectors, credit reporting agencies, all of those good guys, all of those friends of working people. Sarcasm. That was sarcasm, to be clear. I don't know how well sarcasm gets read over podcasts. And yeah, I guess that's pretty much it in a nutshell.
Right on it. Thanks for that. It was cool to hear you reflect on some of your history. Some of our history actually is mirrored. I think we might have a similar age because the 9/11 stuff definitely resonating with that. And actually, interestingly enough, I will confess that I was born in Lynchburg, Virginia, which isn't quite as south. It's not as that close to the coast, but did have family members who went to college in Newport News, so I know that area decently well, and definitely ended up moving to Pittsburgh myself, but definitely kind of understand that milieu. My dad still lives down there, and then yeah, it's interesting you talking about like the Fahrenheit 9/11. I remember that movie, and actually that was quite a radicalizing experience for me as well. I remember, I think it was early Wikipedia, honestly, or early internet searches, figuring out that like Dick Cheney was involved in Halliburton. You know, it's like, what? This is absolutely horrifying. And yeah, and then cool to hear about kind of your history after that and getting involved in socialism early on in your life and what you're up to now. And maybe this is a good segue into it. Another thing I was asking about. I do want to just say one more thing, reflecting on your history a little bit. It's been interesting. I've been asking this question, Emma, to different people I've been interviewing. I've interviewed like 10 people now. And it's so funny, especially on the left, there seems to be like two archetypes developing. Like one is people who grew up in a very like California milieu or like a New York milieu, very left milieu, and they've liberal and kind of went further to the left. And there's other people who like grew up in very rural areas and just reacted very strongly against that. And shout out to your grandma. I didn't want to say that. She sounds like an awesome person. Big shout out to her. But anyways, I did want to ask another thing I've been trying to figure out. It's just kind of like before we get into the nitty gritty of like some of your theories, some of your writing, some of your analysis, like just like zooming out a little and big picture, like to you, what does it mean to be, I'm calling it like the emancipatory left or on like the left wing, or to be a socialist? Like what do these terms like mean to you? And what have they maybe meant historically, or like how do you relate to these kind of terms? And maybe if you want to say why you think that they attract you, why have you defined yourself like that?
Yeah, that's a great question, and I think it's one, unfortunately, that we don't think about enough, and that's uh, we'll get into in my writing that I focus a lot on that question because I think really what being a socialist means at its core is what you do, not what positions you take or what kind of theories you might subscribe to or what things you have read. Being a socialist means that you are fighting to establish the power of the working class over the current ruling class and to bring with that a better world that collectively serves the needs of all people rather than serving the ruling class. And there are different theories about how to achieve that and different ways that people fight for it, but I think that's it at its most basic form. And when I say working class, I don't just mean people who are, working class not defined by a certain income level. Like, I'm not saying, oh, all people who make less than $50,000. Rather, I'm talking about people who work for a living, people who, if they stopped working tomorrow, they wouldn't have any money. They would get thrown out of their homes, they'd starve, they would, et cetera, et cetera. These are people who don't own what Marxists call the means of production. These are people who don't make money just by existing, or have so much wealth that they just make money because they already have money. And those are the people I sue, are the type of people who have so much money that they just make money by having money. What people call passive income, which I've never liked that term because there's nothing passive about it, right? It's vampiric. It sucks the lifeblood out of the world of people who actually work for a living. And in terms of the left more broadly, I really look at that from a historical perspective in terms of coming out of the French Revolution, where the term left wing really sort of was first popularized. And it's kind of hard to know what left wing means anymore when it seems to be an umbrella that everyone from Joe Biden to Bernie Sanders to Fred Hampton is grouped under. And so for myself personally, I really make a point of identifying myself as a socialist rather than as a leftist, because I think even though sometimes the term socialist also gets abused or misused or confused, I think it's still more clear what a socialist is to most people than what a leftist is. And I think it's important too to hold yourself out as having those kind of politics, even though it can be scary to a lot of people. The term socialist is a very loaded one, not just in American history, but in the history of many countries. But it's one worth using because it really is important to center our politics and center the actions that we do to achieve our politics in an idea of the working class taking power and using that power to make a better world for themselves.
Thank you. I heard that, Emma. Thank you for sharing that on the kind of meaning of the left for you, and then and socialism as well. So I was hearing you talk about this interesting kind of formulation of socialism being something you do, not necessarily like a position you take. And I think we'll get at you have this very interesting analysis of like aesthetic politics, or the aesthetic turn. Yeah, and I think we'll get into that. But yeah, and then just kind of very clearly recognizing that yeah, there's a working class struggle. So there's a class of people who aren't working, they own the means of production, and being a socialist means we're organizing with people who don't, who need to work to make a living. And it's very interesting. I think of getting clear on that, I think is important, because there's so many, like, speaking of like the aesthetic, like I think for me, I think for a lot of people too, you think of maybe like working class as like blue collar or something. And nowadays, like, a lot of blue collar workers, I mean, they're definitely blue collar laborers, but there's many of the people who are owning that aesthetic are like, entrepreneurs. They're owning things. They own their truck. They own their contracting business. And when you're in that position, you have a different self-interest. It's much different. And so, someone like a doctor might working class, even though they're making a lot of money. So there's a lot of kind of nuance there. I liked hearing you say that. And before we get into kind of the nitty gritty of some of your writing, where you can, I think, really flesh this stuff out about the aesthetic and the working class, you've talked a little bit about the DSA. I'm so in the DSA, very interested in it. You've been there since 2016. So I'm wondering if you would do like kind of a review 2016, 2022. I mean, in that time, don't have Medicare for all. Bernie Sanders has lost twice. Um, what do you think is the meaning of this? Like, do you think there's something? It's structural. It's a difficult fight, matter of time before we win some of these big picture vision. Get closer to this big picture vision that a lot of people in DSA are talking about. Do you think? Do you have a critique of the strategy or tactics of DSA that you'd like to share and we could dialogue about? I'm curious, just big picture overview of like retrospective and where's DSA at now and from your perspective, maybe on a local level or a national level. Obviously, I was talking on a national level, and a lot of DSA is fighting on local levels, and there's a lot of exciting wins going on. But I'm curious what's coming up for you when I answer or when I pose this question about DSA.
Yeah, I mean, I think you just touched on kind of a fundamental dynamic with DSA, which is that we have many victories at the local level. We just elected two socialists in Milwaukee, for example. Really great victories there. The first socialist electeds in Milwaukee in a very long time. Milwaukee actually used to be a very socialist place. Um, but we haven't penetrated to that kind of national success yet. And I think, the way for us to make that leap is through building membership to higher levels than what we are currently at. And the kind of related goal of being more involved with the labor struggles across the country. I think the recent campaigns by Amazon and Starbucks are very inspiring and have lots of DSA support across the country, lots of really inspiring actions by small local chapters, that are just like 3 or 4 people, but are just showing up to Starbucks every day to protest, to talk to workers. That's great stuff. That's exactly the kind of thing we need to be doing. And, because that is historically how socialists have built power, is by organizing the working class. I mean, it sounds almost tautological to say that, oh, working class politics means you have to organize the working class. But yet, even though it seems so obvious, it's something that unfortunately socialists and the left generally hasn't always focused on. And I think for a long time, the left has languished in this focus on first on analysis. With the new left was obsessed with analysis, obsessed with the correct positions, the correct analysis. And then that morphed into what I talk about in my pieces of an aesthetic politics, a focus on how your individual political self appears to other people around you, and what you can do to make your individual political self look better or more correct or more radical or whatever your personal goal is. And I do think that there has been, DSA hasn't been immune from that problem. I think there has been instances of DSA engaging in aesthetic politics, particularly in our internal conflicts. It's the thing about DSA is I've had many disagreements with people in DSA, but there have been very few times that I've seen a DSA campaign and I've been a DSA campaign that was voted on by membership. I'm not talking about, a random DSA person claiming it's a DSA campaign, but an actual DSA campaign. I can't even think of a single DSA campaign that I've been like, no, that's bad. When these things always come up, it's always an issue of internal fighting in DSA. And it almost always boils down to this idea of aesthetic politics, and that these fights are literally engaged in to show, oh, I am the radical, everyone look at me and how radical I am and how socialist I am, or how, you know, feminist I am, how, et cetera, et cetera.
Got it. Thank you, Emma. Thank you. Very, very helpful. And interesting, thought provoking. Yeah, definitely shout out to Milwaukee. I've been learning a lot about the sewer socialists from Milwaukee, and very inspiring to see that kind of outcropping. And yeah, the Starbucks stuff as well. So it is August 19th. I was just reading earlier, Peters Township in Pittsburgh just won an election, started a union. A lot of exciting stuff going here and all around the country. So it's really, really inspiring, like you said. And yeah, this idea of building internal membership and getting involved in working class struggle, like labor movements, being critical for you, and then also this thing about the aesthetic politics, which maybe we can transition now as being a kind of obstacle, especially in internal stuff. Like people broadly seem to have similar or similar-ish kind of vibe and goals and vision for the future. And even though there's always going to be disagreements on tactics, usually that turns out okay. We can struggle in like comradely ways on that, but then when it comes to this kind of posturing or aesthetic politics, that's when things can get ugly. And I think some of these themes come up in this recent text I was reading by you in the Socialist Forum called "Feminist Freefall," Feminism and Freefall. And I'm curious. So, can you give us a synopsis of that piece and like what inspired you to write it? What was it like writing it? Can you just talk about the creation of this and what it means to you?
Yeah, so I was inspired. I it's the classic inspiration of the writer, which is one day I was feeling depressed about something, and so I decided to write about it. And I'm being a little humorous here, but I'm also not really joking. I really was. I started writing this piece when the Dobbs decision leaked that would overturn Roe v. Wade. And this piece just came out on the Socialist Forum. Uh, uh, so you can tell I've been working on it for a while because that Dobbs decision leaked a while ago, a few months ago. But essentially, I uh, I wasn't so depressed by the Dobbs decision leaking because as an attorney and as a socialist and as a feminist who stays on top of these issues, I knew this was coming. This was a done deal all the way back when Merrick Garland wasn't allowed to take a seat on the Supreme Court under Obama. Like once that happened, I knew that Roe v. Wade was going to get overturned, and I didn't have the naivete that some liberals did, that this was a consecrated right, or the truly astounding thing that they believed any of these ghouls on the Supreme Court when they stated in their hearings that they wouldn't overturn Roe v. Wade, or that Roe v. Wade was decided case law. I never trust anything that a lawyer says. They always have a way for it to technically be the truth, even as they're really lying to you to your face. What depressed me about this wasn't the decision, which was clearly foreseeable, but rather was people's reactions to it. I guess even though I wasn't naive that the decision was coming, I did kind of hold on to some sort of hope that this would shake people awake, that this would be so obvious of a sign of the inefficacy of feminist politics over the last 30 years or more, that people would say, oh, we should really re-examine everything. We should look at how we are trying to achieve feminist political goals. And rather than do that, what I saw was lots of people just doubling down on the way that feminist politics have been carried out since the 1990s, with this focus on, using the correct, quote unquote, correct rhetoric, um, saying things in the right way, posting lots on social media, of course, lots of posts on social media, lots of nonprofits and organizations putting out these statements. Not to be, I won't name anyone specifically. And I understand, if you're a nonprofit, you got to do your hustle for your grant money and whatnot. But we don't need everyone to issue a statement on the overturning of Roe v. Wade. Like, I don't need to know what some 3-person Marxist Leninist party in Georgia thinks about the overturning of Roe v. Wade. Like, I don't care. You know, and the point of putting out those statements, is there very rarely were call to arms or call to actions, and even if they were call to actions, it was in the most general and vague ways. Just calls of, we're not going to let this stand. uh aren't you? Because I don't see you doing anything really about it other than asking people to donate to your organization. Particularly, of course, there was some concerted anger at the Democrats, and very justifiably so, for their rounds of fundraising in the wake of Roe v. Wade being overturned, something that they should have been able to see coming, and that they did very little to stop from happening under the Obama administration. And under the current Biden administration, while they have started to do something after people have pressured them sufficiently, they're still not doing nearly enough. And so, seeing this reaction, and seeing people just double down on these politics as usual, I was trying to think to myself, is there a way that I could spell this out for people and say why this is a problem? And while I started writing this, the Amber Heard trial really started to blow up in the media. And I don't really follow celebrity gossip that much. I look at BuzzFeed every once in a while, so if it's on BuzzFeed, I might catch it. But I don't generally keep up with celebrity gossip. So once something reaches my ears, it has thoroughly saturated the media sphere. So I was like, and I remember talking to a journalist friend of mine who was covering it for her publication at the time. And I said to her, I was like, what is going on here? I thought everyone knew at this point that Johnny Depp was a creep. Like, why is this being re-litigated by the media? And I looked into it, and something I found really fascinating, again, wasn't so much the media spectacle, which was very predictable for the most part. It's certainly not the first time that a man has used a trial to try to vindicate himself. I mean, third wave feminism was born out of Clarence Thomas doing a very similar thing to Anita Hill. But again, it was people's reactions to it. I kept seeing particularly leftist and socialist men saying things along the lines of, oh, well, the whole thing is just fake. This whole thing is just this big show. And of course, in as much as it was this highly sensationalized media trial, there is some truth to that. But it seems like such a simplistic dismissal of what was going on, by people who I wouldn't expect to be so reductive. So I found that curious and I wanted to look into that. And then the last thing was uh, my dad is a doctor. He's a psychiatrist, and he told me he was like, "Oh, there's something that I think you would be really interested in." And he told me about this case of a nurse named Radonda Vaught, who was prosecuted and convicted for negligent homicide after she voluntarily reported that she had mistakenly injected the wrong medication into a patient, a 75-year-old patient, causing his death. And I had originally planned on writing about each of these separately, but I realized that it was all part of the same thing. And I've been obsessed for a long time with what I call aesthetic politics. And aesthetic politics, in short, are politics that reject the traditional model of politics, which is politics focused on building power in order to achieve your political aims. And that can be through many different things, building power through elections, and then you have your elected representatives pass laws to achieve your aims. Or it could be, building power through armed revolution, and then, your revolutionary tribunals issue edicts that carry out whatever your political aims are. And aesthetic politics just rejects all of that. And instead, it's not focused on power at all, but rather it's focused on portrayal of the individual as a political actor. And this political performance that each individual engages in, how that performance is received and reviewed and taken in is the measure of a person's politics. So it's no longer politics about winning, it's politics about performance. And this politics really dates back to the 1960s with groups like which was a feminist group that engaged in this street theater, very elaborate street theater performances. But aesthetic politics didn't really start becoming popular until the 1990s with the rise of third wave feminism, neoliberalism, and sort of a mass consumer culture on a global scale. And aesthetic politics have subsequently been hypercharged, have been reified to extreme extent by social media. And I think we really saw that with the fallout from first the leaked Dobbs decision, and then when the decision actually came out officially, all of these reactions by people on social media, there was this profound sense of hopelessness paired with this profound compulsion to express it and to perform it. So it wasn't just that you felt hopeless about the fact that reproductive rights were in an instant taken away from this country on a federal level. It was also that you had to show that you knew about this and that you cared about it and you were deeply upset about it. And this compulsion affects almost everyone. to differing degrees, but if you consider yourself to be a political person, it's increasingly becoming a essential part of what it means to be a politically engaged person, to the point that if you don't do it, you'll be seen as suspect. If you don't have, some performative reaction to every bit of news, that can itself be treated with suspicion. And so I decided to put all of this together in this piece, Feminism in Free Fall. And, despite everything, I would say, cautiously optimistic about the future of feminism, because of the work of DSA and the work of nurses unions, and many other feminists in the labor movement. I think there is a lot to be hopeful about, but we do need to have this frank reckoning with what feminist politics has been over the last 30 years and how we can be something different than that.
Got it. Thanks, Emma. Yeah, thank you for breaking that down for us. The piece I highly suggested was very illuminating for me personally. So you're taking like three empirical examples, and not so much the example, like you said, they're kind of depressing examples in and of themselves, of course, but um, those are, of course, just symptoms of the assault against women more broadly, that we've been dealing with. But the responses to these examples was really from my perspective, correct me if I'm wrong, but the crux of your analysis was the responses, especially the what you're calling the aesthetic turn in politics, the yeah, the Amber Heard, of course the reaction to Dobbs, not a lot of kind of, in my context either, a lot of outpouring about it, but not a lot of sustained kind of movement building, not reckoning with, like, something I remember. I did my own performative call on social media, and I said the only response to this is we need to abolish the Senate, abolish the Supreme Court. People need to have this conversation. Socialists need to do that. And the response I got back from that, from most people, was like, "That's a horrible idea. The right wants to do that, or this is a conservative position." It's just like, oh my gosh. Yeah, it's like these are the structural things we're fighting against, and but then, yeah, and then anyways, just the Amber Heard stuff. I mean, what struck me about that one too was this really horrible, um, just how mental health, like the borderline personality stuff, was invoked, and just the woman as crazy, kind of just blatantly, just baldly. It was quite stunning to me, to witness some of that, the strong counter reaction, some of the earlier movements that were going on mostly on social media. And then I'm curious though, this third case was the new one to me. Your piece did introduce me to that case, and I personally find it. I mean, obviously, you touch on this in the piece. Not a good situation. In that kind of profession, there probably needs to be some kind of disciplinary measures. But the homicide thing, especially when you see, people like cops, politicians doing grossly negligent things, just getting away with it, and this nurse is arrested and given this trial for making a mistake and even admitting it, just seems horrible. But can you talk a little? Can we dig into that for a second? So, what do you see in the response? Was it just the lack of response, that you're kind of diagnosing here, or what's the connection between the turn to aesthetic politics and in the wake of this kind of decision? Or could we just, that's the one I still don't have as much of a grip on, except for just kind of moral disgust, honestly. Yeah, can you talk a little bit more about that case and how you link it to the others?
Yeah, so I think this case was really different than the other cases, and that's kind of why I chose it to really contrast. So The case involved a nurse named Redonda Vaught who gave a 75-year-old patient an injection of a drug called bucuronium. Um, no one correct me on the pronunciation of that. I don't care how it's pronounced. Uh, it was a really bad decision on her part. It stopped her patient's breathing, and she died. Um, and that's obviously a terrible thing to happen. And certainly, while it was a mistake and she did voluntarily report the mistake, she should have been held accountable for it, of course. But what happened wasn't that she was held accountable for it. She was prosecuted and convicted of criminally negligent homicide and abuse of an impaired adult. And this was much more, as much as the district attorney's office kept saying over and over again that this wasn't the case. This was more than just about this one nurse and her one decision. Because when the second you say that a nurse's mistake equals criminally negligent homicide, that's an attack on the entire nursing profession. And what was so interesting to me about the response to this case versus the response to the other two cases that I mentioned was that there was a really concerted and clear political response to it, and one that was not about individuals. It wasn't, again, these performative social media posts, but instead it was actual organizing. Nurses showed up to her trial every day, other nurses, just to be there and show solidarity and support for her. And nurses unions put out statements where they talked about, they didn't just say, oh, this is terrible, this is an attack on us, but they talked about the very specific material reasons why this was happening and what needed to be done about it. They pointed out, for example, that the hospital in this case reported that the patient died of natural causes instead of notifying federal regulators. Whereas the nurse in this case voluntarily reported it and was being honest and upfront about what happened, the hospital immediately tried to cover it up. And it just goes to show that, nurses are currently, things were bad. There's been a nursing shortage for a long time, driven largely by the fact that nursing teachers, the nursing professors at nursing colleges get paid far less than nurses do. It's the wildest dynamic of like any kind of profession you could ever imagine. I'm not aware of any other profession that has that kind of disparity. These nursing professors will get paid like $30,000 a year. It's crazy. And because of that, of course, no one wants to do it, right? No matter how much you might love nursing and want to teach other people how to be nurses, if you can't get paid for it, you can't do it. And so for that reason, we've had a shortage of nursing in this country, of nurses in this country for a very, very long time. And then that has been really pushed to the brink by the COVID-19 pandemic, which has really driven people out of the nursing profession or to sort of migrate within the nursing profession to different areas, out of intensive care, out of emergency room to other fields. And this attack has been waged by our privatized healthcare system, by the hospitals, by the health insurance companies. And what has really saved us wasn't, people clapping for the nurses for what, like a week after the COVID pandemic started, before we all went back to treating them like shit again, or flying jets over the hospitals. I mean, God, this country is a parody of itself sometimes. No, it's nurses unions. Nurses have well, compared to other labor movements in other countries, obviously not very powerful or large. But in terms of within the United States, nurses have one of the largest union presence in the United States. And of course, while things have changed a lot since, the 1960s, nursing is still a predominantly woman profession, and even more importantly, it's a very gendered profession. The type of work that you're doing as a nurse and the nursing theory of healthcare is one that's very gendered and seen as feminine, even if it's a man that's doing it. And so, of course, whenever problems exist in the healthcare world, it's expected that nurses are going to put them on their backs and do them. And the nurses unions have been fighting back against that, particularly with demands for better staff ratios, asking to have essentially just to hire more nurses so that, one nurse isn't having to take care of an insane number of patients by herself. And, what this case was really about was saying to the nurses, oh, if you're going to point the finger at privatized healthcare, if you're going to point the finger at the current ruling class and the way that we structure things under capitalism, we're going to put the blame on you. We're going to point things back at you. And, this is a very serious case. I mean, it's homicide. People go to prison for many years when they are convicted, even of criminally negligent homicide. And, certainly the consequences, and not to diminish what Amber Heard was put through, but certainly the consequences in this case were much more severe than what Amber Heard was facing. But the response by the nurses union and by the nurses who showed up every day to support Redonda Vaught worked. The district attorney's office, they saw what was happening and they were like, oh, we got to be careful here. We're pissing off a lot of people. And, she wound up not getting any prison time because of it. She just got 3 years of supervised probation, which is still, putting her through this prosecution, and that 3 years of supervised probation is just an injustice and still so completely unnecessary. But it just goes to show that, collective power works. When you respond to injustice with collective power rather than just individual outrage or individual consternation, or even just individual theories of what to do. But when you put aside your individual self and instead focus on a collective response to something, that's when you're able to actually affect change, when you're able to diminish the injustices being done.
Yeah, thanks for clarifying that for me. So I think it was a failure in reading comprehension. The third case is the counterpoint, is the positive example of a response that works, or that was effective in the face of. I think one of the points you made in your response was really poignant. I hadn't thought of it this way, but the kind of I'm assuming this is a stereotype, but talk about the nursing theory of kind of care, and the kind of nursing approach being more of, yeah, like caretaking, care, more feminine, coming out of like a feminist theory. And then you've got the administrator, who is, the criminal here, really the person who committed a fraud. And I'm just assuming wasn't prosecuted, probably got promoted or has raised. That to me was really poignant, and really points out the structural component of this. I think you make the point in your piece is that it's not even that, like, Johnny Depp, the administrator at the hospital, they're not getting together in a cartel of patriarchs, wanting to punish women, but structurally these are the incentives and the things that are going to happen. And the nurses union responded to that in a really strong way, and was able to still, what had happened is completely unjust, but not going to jail for long periods of time like you could for criminally negligent homicide. And it does seem, connecting it with the abortion thing, it does seem like a shot. It's like healthcare, like, I'm thinking, with criminalizing nurses and people in healthcare for these kind of actions is really problematic in a lot of ways, in this individual case, but more broadly. Maybe this goes to another question I wanted to ask you about, with this piece. And I think it goes to this point about the nurses union. You talk about movement feminism, or you posit this idea of movement feminism in your piece, and you like cite examples in like Colombia and in Ireland, and then in the historical feminist movement in the US. I'm wondering if you could talk about like maybe some of those historical examples in your studies, and then also like how you see maybe this third case applying to that, and also your vision for, like feminism, movement feminism in the DSA, movement feminism in the left in the US, like something we could put down on Instagram, or TikTok maybe, or whatever we're using, and build movement feminism in the US, maybe working towards that vision. Could you, is anything coming up for you when I throw all that out?
Yeah, so I think essentially what movement feminism is, and how I see it as different from the feminism of the aesthetic politics that we've seen in the last 30 years, is movement feminism is really focused on building a collective political power. And I'm not trying to be prescriptive here about how we build that political power. My aim with this is much more humble. I just want us to be interested in building political power again. Now, personally, I do think that I'm of the opinion that you should essentially build political power through whatever means are currently effective in your situation. So sometimes that means electing people, having electoral campaigns. Sometimes it means pushing for a union drive or pushing for a strike. Sometimes it means, doing defense of an abortion clinic like we do here in New York City. Or I know Pittsburgh DSA, I don't know if they currently do it, but I know at one point they did these great protest of these awful institutions called crisis pregnancy centers, which are essentially fake abortion clinics that try to trick women into coming in, and then they try to brainwash them and indoctrinate them with all sorts of evangelical Christian stuff and anti-abortion stuff. And I think you should use whatever tactics are effective in your arena, and you shouldn't really close yourself off to any. You should look at the material conditions that you're in and choose based on those. But really, the important thing that I'm focused in on in this piece, and in a lot of my writing and most of my writing, is that if we're not building power, it doesn't matter. Your outrage about the overturning of Roe v. Wade or even your analysis of the overturning of Roe v. Wade. You can, deconstruct that thing to the nth degree. You can go full Foucault on it. It will not matter if you don't have political power to actually change anything about it. And the way that capitalism works is by instilling power in people who have control over the economy, capitalists. And the capitalists exercise their power mostly through moving capital in one way or the other. It can be very minuscule movements, such as the day-to-day labor exploitation, anti-competitive practices by Amazon, all those kind of things. Or it can be something very extreme like capital flight, where when some countries have gone socialist or even just to the left to a certain degree, capitalists will pull out all of the money and all of the resources from the area to essentially try to cause it to collapse, like they've been doing to Cuba for several decades. The only way that we can match that kind of power in the current system is by acting collectively. Individually, we will never be able to do anything to even get close to challenging that kind of power. And, going back to what we were talking about earlier about DSA's current lack of nationwide or federal level success, it just goes to show you that even when we do exercise collective power, it's really difficult to win. It's really difficult to get successes. And so, if an organization of, if we can't win things with an organization of 100,000 people, or however many fellow travelers we have on various different campaigns, why do you think your individual voice or your your individual speaking truth to power is going to change anything? And I think a lot of people realize that it isn't, right? I don't think people are stupid. I'm not, I think I try to avoid in my writing the kind of sneering tone you hear in a lot of pieces that criticize these kind of politics. The most famous probably of any of these kind of pieces is Escaping the Vampire Castle, which in some ways is a good piece, but I think it could have been so much more well received if it had injected more empathy into it. Because I think we're all victims of this kind of politics, and we've all been guilty to one degree or another of engaging in it. I mean, it's not, historically unprecedented either. I mean, people have always cared about aesthetics to one degree or another, and aesthetics have always had a place in politics. You can look at examples of that from ancient Rome, let alone from the modern day. But what's different about modern day is the aesthetic politics have gone so far as to actually outright reject traditional politics and even be hostile to those who do engage in traditional politics of building power and trying to change things. And that's something we really have to adamantly fight against, because it's done so much damage. I mean, a lot of people point to, how crafty the right wing has been in their decades-long goal to overturn Roe v. Wade, all of the money and political maneuvering they've done over the many decades. I think while it's certainly important to look at how they achieved this goal, at the same time, I think people give them way too much credit, because look at how they've been fumbling ever since they actually achieved this. I mean, they can't get their messaging straight. They failed in Kansas to undo the constitutional amendment protecting reproductive rights in that state. When it comes to any actual, political mobilization that involves real politics rather than these backroom deals with, judicial ghouls, they're not good. They're not good at this stuff. It's just that the Democrats are even worse, unfortunately. So, it's really important for us to start focusing on collective organizing, and particularly in terms of, for feminists, focusing on the collective organizing of working class women, the people who are actually impacted by these things and who have largely been left behind by the feminist movement since, really since like the 1980s, when the feminist movement started becoming obsessed with academia and these, highbrow theories of gender performativity and so on. When really that's not, as far as I'm concerned, that's not what feminism is about. Feminism is much more like I was saying about with socialism. Feminism is about what you do to advance the liberation of women, not what you say about it or what you theorize about it.
Yeah, thank you, Emma. That's really, really helpful to unpack, like, not necessarily a prescriptive vision towards movement feminism, but just kind of the foundation of it, of what we do. And I'm curious how you're feeling right now. Are you up for? I also read a great piece of yours about the political compass test. It's a bit of a shift. Do you have maybe 20 more minutes to talk about that? Is it okay?
Yeah. Let's dig in.
Okay. It's a bit a different tack. It's where I found your work, and I was doing some research on this thing, the political compass test, seeing a lot of memes about it, and I was like, what is this thing? And I was like, has there been it kind of struck me as off. The vibe was off, and I was like, why? Like, what don't I like about it? Because I like, nonsense personality tests. Like, I like to talk about astrology. I find that fun, but this was not hitting for me. And I was like, has there been any critiques of this I can dig into? And found your work on Medium, which of course I'll link to that, and of course the recent piece as well. But so you've written about the political compass test, and you call the piece "Kill the Political Compass Test in Your Head." Can you describe your critique? Maybe say a little bit. I mean, I'm sure people have seen this thing, but can you say a little bit about the test, how you came to write that piece, and maybe like we did for the similar for the last piece, what was your critique all about?
Yeah, I mean, I came to write this piece pretty much in the same way that you found it. I seen this meme for a long time, and I very much intentionally refer to the political compass as a meme because it operates in our media and in our culture as a meme rather than as some sort of political tool or what have you. It's very much about communicating something about yourself or about another person or a historical figure or what have you through this visual media. And I've always taken pleasure out of criticizing things that are reductive in some sort of way. And so I figured that there was more to this political compass thing, because I could see just on a surface level that there was something very off about it. Because, the first time I think I ever saw this meme, the first thing that really jumped out to me was, the fact that it is it's a graph, XY graph, with 4 quadrants, equal size quadrants, in clockwise order, being authoritarian right, libertarian left, authoritarian left. And the first thing that jumped out to me was this idea of these equal quadrants, that there's like this scientific degrees of equal gradations of an economic left and an economic right, and authoritarian versus libertarian. And as I talk about in the piece, the idea of the excuse me, the idea of these equal quadrants, excuse me. The idea of these equal quadrants is pretty fallacious, because there are very few people who fit into the libertarian right quadrant. If you look at our electorate, if you look at politics in general, just the history of politics of the world for the last 500 years, you're going to find very few libertarian right people, because it is a fairly paradoxical set of politics. In order for free market capitalism to exist, you have to have an authoritarian state. You have to have a state that's willing to restrict the freedoms, particularly of working class people, and to violently enforce property and contract relations. So, seeing these sort of facial problems, I decided to look into it and try to figure out, who's behind this thing. And it, while it's unclear as to who really did it, the theory is that it's this guy Wayne Brittenden, who refers to himself as a political journalist, but he's really a muckraker. He's this guy in New Zealand who has this blog with an amazing name. I got to give him credit for the amazing name, which is Shalom Kiwi. I got to give credit for the great name, Shalom Kiwi. Subtitle: Kiwi Views on Israel and Jewish Matters. And it features such great headlines as, "Why won't New Zealand's anti-racism chief condemn Jeremy Corbyn's racism?" And "Doctor has more sympathy for Palestinian terrorists than their victims." So it's clear he's got his own hobby horse political agenda, which of course everyone does. That doesn't necessarily mean the political compass is bad or ineffective or unscientific. I just threw in those details into the piece because I thought it was kind of funny and added some flavor into it. And I do think the meme has really been abstracted from its origin, and I think it's why Brittenden refuses to take credit for it and acknowledge that he created it, because I think him and other people like to think of it as this scientific, objective thing that didn't come out of politics, but is this abstracted viewpoint of politics, almost like from the outside. Like it's this perfectly apolitical person being like, yes, right there. That's where that politics goes. And I won't go through the entire piece. People can read the piece if they're interested in it. But the whole idea of the meme as objective and scientific really breaks down when you look at specific examples, like the idea of Hitler and Stalin as mirror images of each other. I mean, even if you as a person find both of those people to be contemptible, and I personally am not I'm not a fan of Hitler or Stalin. I know, controversial to take on the podcast right now, but uh, even if you're not fans of Hitler and Stalin, like yours truly, uh, uh, any sort of honest historical examination of the two figures and the governments that they presided over will quickly show that they are not mirror images of each other. Their disagreements ran a lot deeper than just economics. And it gets even more silly when people on the left try to chart out differences between the left on this gradation. Particularly, Americans have so much anxiety and are so obsessed over the idea of being authoritarian, and I think it's because of how capitalist this country is, and really being founded in these colonial pioneer narratives of these, industrious, rugged adventurers going out on their own and, establishing everything by themselves. And those values run so deep that even leftists kind of internalize it and want to be that themselves. They want to be the rugged individual, just the rugged individual fighting for social justice, I guess, rather than, colonialism. Um, and when the reality is that individualism is more often less democratic than so-called authoritarianism. That the tyranny of the minority is much more commonplace, at least in this country, than any kind of tyranny of the majority. And it's individual property rights in this country that are most responsible for the deprivation of others, both in economic terms, but also in social terms too. I mean, even if you're thinking about things like LGBT rights and so forth, the reason why we haven't been able to progress as a society beyond things like homophobia and transphobia is because we as a society say, well, if you have billions of dollars, you get to be a super powerful person in our society. And there are super powerful billionaires who are like, I hate gay people. I'm going to throw a bunch of money at that. And very powerful institutions too, like the Catholic Church, of course, which fought tooth and nail for that to get the Kansas Constitution changed recently. They poured tons of money into that, and failed, of course. I feel like I'm going a little astray of the piece here, ranting about the Catholic Church. Let's see.
No, I mean, I think that's helpful to connect it with I think there is something there with I'm seeing a connection between your most recent article and kind of the aesthetic turn, and like especially how we're framing some like the example of like Hitler, Stalin, like it's less of an actual analysis of these figures and especially their historical periods and milieu that they're in, and more so just like some kind of gloss, some kind of aesthetic understanding of him. I was also thinking, okay, this is kind of ridiculous at this point. We're near the end, so it's like I was thinking with the political compass test being kind of secret. Like, what if it's Satoshi, the Bitcoin guy, also created the political compass test to legitimize libertarianism? I was like, wow, I could like propagate this conspiracy theory right now that the political compass test was designed to like pave the way for Bitcoin being accepted. But that will need to offer you my own
I believe it.
Yeah.
I believe it.
I want to ask you. Go ahead. Sorry.
No, just saying that makes sense to me. You tell me that, I'd be like, sure.
Okay. Maybe we'll write like a fanfic or something about that. But I did want to ask you just maybe as a kind of final thing on this one to wrap this one up. I highly say this is a really, first of all, Emma, I think in both pieces, your historical analysis is really important. I think that is something you do say in the piece that jumped out to me. It was really striking about a lot of like kind of another symptom of our time is like the so-called intellectual dark web. Jonathan Haidt is another kind of right-wing centrist, someone who is kind of naturalizing capitalist and liberal ideology and saying it's scientific. It's extremely ideological. And one thing that all of these ideas, including the political compass tests, have in common is they bracket history. Like there's no history, it's the end of history. And you connect the end of history meme, which has just been, we obviously know that's false because of Trump, Brexit, COVID-19, all these things have completely shown that myth or that meme to be ridiculous. But a lot of the ideas and practices have stayed with us, like something like the political compass test, or like these kind of, I think he has the moral foundations on this Heights idea, which I'm in my thinking, I'm linking these like ideologically at least. But anyways, I wanted to ask you, and so what I was trying to say is that you bring that historical analysis into to what you're doing and everything that I've read that you're writing. And that's something I'd really suggest that people look into in the piece, because you've talked about like the 60s with the performative thing, but you go back to like the third estate or the three estates in France, and that's really helpful. I did want to ask you though, how, as socialists, like how important is a kind of analysis, a proper analysis of various like historical formations? Like, if I want to understand the rise of Trump, the rise of right-wing nationalism, maybe looking back like why Thatcherism and Reaganism were so popular, these kind of things that pop up. How important is it for us to have an analysis of these kind of situations to inform our kind of practices? And if we're not going to utilize memes like the political compass test, like what's a better way to approach analyzing current events or historical events in a way that kind of makes sense and actually informs our practices? I don't know if that makes sense, but do you have any responses coming up?
Yeah. So my husband is a history teacher, so history is very important. Very important. But yeah, no, I mean, I in many ways I am kind of an old school orthodox Marxist, as some people like to call it. And I think that historical analysis is really crucial to have a good understanding of of modern politics, to understand where things came from and to understand how things change, and particularly how the organization of our economy in both the present and the past has shaped the organization of our society in general. And I don't think there's a difference between having a good understanding of history and having a good understanding of theory. And I've tried to address this in other pieces I've written, where I think you don't have to be an academic. You don't have to have a PhD in order to have a good socialist understanding of history. And in fact, throughout history, some of the best histories have been oral histories, have been histories passed on from working class people to each other by word of mouth. And I think it's really important when we do talk about history to try to talk about it in ways that are clear, and be clear with our terms and our references. I think Marxists in the 20th century and even going into the 21st century got so obsessed with their own ideological battles, and essentially just started speaking a different language entirely from other people, and these arguments they had with one another over things like, oh, was the Soviet Union state capitalism, or was it a degraded worker state, or was it a, bureaucratic centralism, or, using all of these kind of terms that, rather than elucidating things and making things more clear, it just obfuscated things and made the circle of people who could actually understand and take part in these discussions smaller. And as socialists, we really want to, I'm not, this is always a good way to start a sentence. I'm not a Maoist, but Maoism has this idea of a mass line that I do think there is some real merit to, this idea that, with any kind of working class politic, when you're thinking about your theories and your way of structuring politics, you should not just talk among, your vanguard enlightened friends, but you should actually be going out to working class people and talking to them about these ideas, and seeing how they respond to them. I think it's one of the biggest benefits to electoral campaigning, for example, is being able to have those conversations with people in a way that people are willing to engage in. Because, of course, as we all know, most people in the United States are not political. They don't want to have political conversations. They don't care to have political conversations. And usually your best hope of being able to engage someone in a political discussion is talking about elections, because that is the way that most people in this country, unfortunately, at this point, participate in politics. Now, hopefully, we can get to a point where that won't be the case anymore, but that's the current material conditions we live under. And, having discussions with people in that realm is super important. And again, it doesn't need, I don't, when I'm knocking doors for DSA, I don't go and knock on someone's door and say, what do you think about the Soviet Union? Do you think it was state capitalism or a deformed workers state? But certainly I'll just give one example where I was knocking doors for a candidate here in Brooklyn, David Alexis, and his wife suffers from sickle cell anemia. And we were I was at the door of a voter, and I asked her what issues were important to her, and she said racism. And so I brought up sickle cell anemia and the way that our society has historically treated sickle cell anemia and just health problems in the Black community in general historically. And I didn't start spouting off theories of critical race theory or Afro pessimism or anything like that. I mean, I don't know this woman. Maybe she knows about those theories, maybe she doesn't. But most importantly, I didn't need to use these kind of academic theories in order to have a conversation with her about how racism has functioned historically in this country. And I think those are the kind of conversations we need to have. And I think the most important thing for socialists to do is to get a good understanding of history from a materialist perspective. And theory comes later. Theory arises from our understanding of history, not vice versa. So if you don't have a good understanding of history, you shouldn't be diving into theory, because without a good understanding of history, you might just believe in a theory because it sounds cool. I mean, I think unfortunately that winds up being the case for a lot of people, something like third worldism, for example, which, for people not familiar with it, third worldism is this idea that the first world is just so politically backwards and corrupt that there's no point in political action in the first world, and we should just be focused on fomenting revolution in the third world. That's the only way we're going to save the world or whatever. And if you just know some basic facts about the world and how truly deprived the third world is by the first world, that theory can sound very appealing. It can sound like, oh yeah, of course, the third world are the good guys and the first world are the bad guys. This theory makes sense to me. But if you have a good understanding of history, it's clear that that's just flim flam nonsense.
Yeah, thank you, Emma, for that, helping us untangle some of these ideas about theory and historical analysis and kind of your journey learning about that. And obviously, history is important in your household. So thanks for giving that, sharing that with us. And thank you very much for being generous with your time. This has been extremely thought provoking and illuminating for me, and I've loved reading your stuff. And I'm curious if you could indulge me in one more question. I wanted to ask for the audience sake, what where can we find your stuff? Like if we're like really enjoying it and want to like follow what you're doing, the writing you're doing, the stuff you're creating, the thinking you're doing about socialism politics, what can we do? I'll of course be linking where I share this, the pieces we referenced, but maybe you could say more. If we want to follow your work, is there any best places?
Yeah. So I've become something of a recluse.
Okay.
I don't have very much social media anymore. I still post pictures of my cats on Instagram if you want to see pictures of cats. Um, I am trying to write more though. Again, pick up my writing again. And I'm probably going to really focus on publishing in DSA publications.
Cool.
And I think publications like Socialist Forum are just great in general. I mean, this issue that I was in has so many amazing pieces about things like gun control and tobacco and the current state of socialism. I mean, it's just a really great collection of pieces. And I really appreciate how thoughtful everyone writes in this form. It's exactly the kind of writing I think we need in the socialist movement. And yeah, people should join DSA. It's really important to get involved in an organization that's trying to build collective power. You don't have to think DSA is perfect. You don't have to agree with what everyone in DSA says. But it's a great organization that's at the forefront of fights from abortion rights to climate justice, and we really need your support. So everyone should join DSA.
Cool. So we will read Socialist Forum and join DSA if we haven't already. That sounds like a good plan. So thank you so much, Emma, and for your writing for these pieces and for coming on the Theory podcast. So I hope you have a good rest of your night.
Thanks for having me on.
Bye.